Okay, we are currently like in the midst of a series where we're talking about membership, right? Over the past few weeks, we've talked about friendship, Jesus, sin, shalom. This week, I want to talk about grace. Specifically, I want to talk about how grace moves us. I think grace is a curious thing. Almost everyone who is a Christian, and a lot who aren't, actually would say they believe in it. Like, when's the last time you met somebody that's like, no, I do not believe in grace? Give them exactly what nobody, in other words, everybody says they're on board with grace, for the most part. But very few people can actually define it, let alone explain how it makes any difference in their lives, how it's any kind of power for change or transformation, let alone to actually start putting it into practice. Most people, if you press them on it, are going to say grace means being nice or polite, gracious, or maybe giving people a second chance. I think grace is actually a nuclear fuel that powers the gospel. And we need to learn to live by it, to embody it, and to offer it to others. And once you experience it, grace changes everything. And for me, I was 30 years into like being a follower of Jesus before I felt like I really understood it. And it just about cost me everything. So, here's the outline for today. I want to talk about the prominence of grace in the scriptures. I want to talk about an encounter with grace in my own personal story. I want to talk about the implications of grace, 5 things that I've learned. So prominence, I'm going to take 10 minutes just to give you like a whirlwind, like kind of overview of grace in the New Testament. And then I'm going to take about 20 minutes to try to tell you my story. And then I'm going to take about another 10 minutes to try to give you 5 implications. Does that make sense? So prominence in Scripture, encounter in my story, implications of grace. And then we can talk about this over lunch a little bit, because I think there's some things here. This is probably the most important thing we cover in membership. And this is one of the things that I have had the hardest time finding content for. And so what I did was I landed on, I'm actually going to tell my story and my experience, and you can decide what you think. All right? So let's start by talking about the prominence of grace. I have in my notes, grace is a shy little creature. Now here's what I mean by that. It only shows up one place in the Gospels. Did you know that? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? One place. You're in it. We just read it. John chapter 1, verses 14 through 18. Okay, but here's the interesting thing. It's almost everywhere else in the New Testament, all through the rest. And almost always the way that it is used is implicit, meaning the authors kind of assume you know what they mean by it and they just reference it, but they never actually define it or unpack it. It's kind of like the doctrine of the Trinity. There's not a specific passage that says, here, let me explain this to you. It's very similar with grace, but it's in there. And so if you're going to understand it, you kind of have to learn to glean. So what I want to do is just take John 1, and I want to show you what I mean by gleaning. So let's just read through this again a second time, kind of slowly, and I'm just going to highlight parts. So look at verse 14. The Word became flesh. We're in Advent, right? You remember in Matthew when the angel shows up to Joseph and says, you're going to call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. In other words, Jesus coming into the world, save people from sins. Well, guess what? Here is the Word becoming flesh, and right after it, you're going to see grace. So whatever sins are and whatever grace is, those two things are actually linked together. All right? The Word became flesh, dwelt among us. We have seen his glory as the only Son of the Father. And you say, well, what does his glory look like? In other words, what is it that makes Jesus amazing? And it says right after that, he is full of grace and truth. So whatever this grace thing is, it actually involves truth and truth-telling. In other words, grace is not just overlooking. Grace is not just pretending something didn't happen. Okay? Grace has some component of truth, some component of truth-telling. I'm just going to add this, but not in a way that hardens or embitters. In other words, there's a way to actually use the truth, and you sit there and go, let me tell you the truth about yourself, Brennan, and I pound you with all your flaws. And what it actually does is it doesn't make you like soft and like wanting to hear, it actually makes you like, well, fuck you, okay? It hardens people. So whatever this truth thing is, and this grace thing together, I don't think that it hardens or embitters. I think it actually is truth in a way that softens, opens, and makes us receptive. Jesus, full of grace and truth. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Whatever grace is, it describes something essential about Jesus, fullness, but it also implies sharing. From his fullness, we have received, sharing, bestowing, dealing. In other words, there is an interpersonal aspect of grace. It is fundamentally relational. You see what we're getting? We're just building a little picture of what grace is. It's actually right at the heart of who Jesus was. It's connected to truth, but in a way that doesn't make us hard and bitter and resistant. It actually softens us, and it involves a sharing where we see the truth about ourselves, but instead of landing as bad news, it actually lands as good news. The law was given through Moses. Think about that. Old covenant, instructions, rules. Grace and truth came through Jesus. He is actually saying, just like you can talk about old covenant, new covenant, law, gospel, that's how significant grace and truth is. It is right up there in one of those key categories for understanding the entire Bible, the entire story of the Bible. In other words, whatever grace is, it is a really, really big deal. And what I would argue is that even though the word doesn't occur very much in the Gospels, what Jesus is doing is modeling grace in how he deals with people. He tells people the truth about themselves, and there's a certain kind of person that as they hear the truth about themselves, they melt. And they love him, and they want to follow him. And ironically, those are the people that see themselves as sinners, poor, broken, impossible to change themselves. Let me give you a few more examples. In Acts chapter 4, great grace was upon them all. In other words, this grace thing that was true of Jesus actually became true of the early Christian community. Acts chapter 6, verse 8. Stephen, full of grace, actually preached a really fiery sermon that got himself killed. Okay? But the point is, we can be filled with grace in the same way that Jesus was filled with grace. Acts chapter 11, verse 23. Peter came and he saw the grace of God. In other words, he sees it at work in a group of people, and he's like, these guys have really encountered grace. I can see a fruit of it. Acts chapter 13, verse 43. Paul and Barnabas urged them to continue in the grace of God. You look all over the New Testament. It's always implicit. It's never really spelled out. Malachi already mentioned the passage from 1 Peter 1:13. Prepare your minds for action, being sober-minded, clear-headed. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And Malachi is exactly right when he said that's not just future, that's constant revealing. In other words, there is something about the encounter with Jesus that actually, the word that best characterizes that is grace. Now I want you to think for just a second what we said right at the beginning, how this word, everybody says they believe in it, and very few people can actually describe it or explain it, but that's a fundamental characteristic of our hope in Jesus. What does that say? We need to know this and we need to understand it. It's very, very central. Your grounding hope about how you live right now, okay, in grace already present, it's at work, but there's even more to come. Do you see how important this is? You could argue grace is one of the most central concepts in the New Testament story. And we should be asking ourselves, does it move me? And the answer for me for almost 30 years was no, it didn't really. It wasn't until I understood it in a whole new way, all of a sudden it changed my life completely. So maybe if you're sitting here going, my life doesn't feel very changed by Jesus, maybe this grace thing could actually be helpful. Okay? I think it's a power to transform us. So, all right, let's talk about an encounter with grace, and I'm just going to share my story. Some of you guys have heard this before. Some of you have probably heard it a couple of times. Apologies. You hear it again. This is going to be super personal and probably very adult. I apologize. We're going to treat you like an adult. You get to hear it, and your parents can help debrief it. Okay? All right. I was conceived out of wedlock. My parents met in college. Senior year, got pregnant. University of Idaho in Moscow. They did the responsible thing, got married. For back then, that was responsible, right? Now what you'd do is you'd go get an abortion, or you take a morning after pill. Okay? Mom dropped out of school to have me. My dad graduated and went to Vietnam, where he flew helicopters, Marine Corps. He was the only pilot in his squadron that never took a hit. And what was ironic about that was that wasn't because he wasn't in the midst of the action, he was. Early on in their marriage, my mom had at least one affair. And she told my dad about it. And so my dad, again, did like the responsible thing. He took out a life insurance policy. He went over to Vietnam and he volunteered for everything he could. Why? It's the respectable way out. He'll give his life, service to the country. His kid will be taken care of, but he's out of it. He was not a Christian. On board the aircraft carrier, he met a guy named Ken Torrey who led him to the Lord. My dad is going like, crazy stuff is happening that I can't explain why I'm not dying. And Ken's like, I think I know. So my dad becomes a Christian. He comes home. They kind of patch things up. They have 3 more kids.
So that solves everything.
Well, it didn't solve everything. Summer of 1979, I was 10 years old. So basically, this is how my summer went down. I turned 10 at the end of May. My grandmother gave me The Lord of the Rings. I spent all June just like devouring The Lord of the Rings. I was in a plane crash early July, survived it. Right after that, mid-July, my mom and my dad sit down in the living room and mom says, I'm leaving. And she said, your siblings, Nori, Jake, Nick, they're all too little to decide. They're going with me. You're 10 years old. You're old enough. Who do you want to live with? And I went, I'm staying with Dad. Which I couldn't actually do because Dad was a traveling salesman on the road. So I was going to have to go live with my grandparents. But I didn't know. At the time, I'm just like, I am not going with my mom.
Why?
Why? Because it felt so wrong.
Because she was leaving.
Yeah. It just was like, it was ironic because I was actually closest to my mom. It felt so very wrong. And my dad had, I don't know insight into their relationship, but I had never seen them fight. I had never seen my dad like yell at her. I'd never seen anything like that. He'd always worked really, really hard to take care of the family. He gave her everything she kind of asked for. She was just really unhappy. And, you know, again, I don't know the backstory to that, but as a 10-year-old, here's what I know. In the middle of July, she said, I'm leaving. Okay, and by the end of July, or the end of August, she's gone. And I remember her standing on the porch, and she said to my dad, she gives me a hug, she says to my dad, I think I'm making a mistake, and then gets in the car and drives off with the guy she's going to marry 5 days later. So my mom went from I'm leaving your dad to I'm remarried in 4 to 6 weeks. And my world came unglued as a 10-year-old. One of the things I think is that everybody experiences at some point in their life. It could be as young as 4, 5, 6. It could be as old as 20s or 30s. But at some point in our lives, the world shifts from being like a warm and fuzzy place. Like think about Ransom's experience of the world right now. Everybody loves babies, right? So if you're a little kid, you're like, this is just great. So you're basically a puppy. And everybody's like, oh, look at the puppy, he's so cute. And somewhere, when you're in your teens or your 20s or your 30s, the world falls apart and you realize that like people hurt each other. And they do really, really bad things, hard things. And so you go from being like warm and fuzzy to like battlefield with body parts. Deep, and we're like, oh, the world is a dark place. Oh, people do really, really hard things to one another. So for me, that happened at 10. All right? The rest of our lives will be spent answering the question, how am I going to put my life back together again? So whenever you experience that thing, you're actually going to build the rest of your life around trying to put the pieces back together again so you feel whole and complete. Okay? For me, I actually, and I probably could not have articulated this at the time, this is more looking back, I actually decided I need to find somebody who's never going to leave me like my mom. And the way that manifested itself very, very quickly was that I was interested in girls. Okay? And it was actually not just like girls, it was like I was looking for relationship. Like I wanted friendship, I wanted relationship, I wanted partnership. And dude, I'm talking in the 5th grade. Okay? I would love to see some psychologist analyze me. Because they'd probably go like I absolutely think there is a connection with what happened there and like all of my dating history. All right? So I went and lived with my grandparents for a year while my dad tried to get promoted while he was on the road. My mom remarries. She's pregnant by Christmas, which means my little brain goes, now I never would have said this at the time. My little brain goes, fuck. That's the absolutely appropriate word here. This is not coming back together. I had been hoping that when she said, maybe I made a mistake, she's going to come to her senses, she's going to get back, you know, like we're all going to be a happy family again. Not going to happen. So I realized that. The second thing that happened while I was living with my grandparents in California, they had not had kids in the house for a while. Okay? My dad was, or my grandfather was a chain pipe smoking ex-Marine who had Playboys and Penthouse stashed all over the house. So guess what I discovered as a 5th grader who's reeling relationally, emotionally? I discovered porn. 5th grade. that was something that actually, so on the one hand, I've got a deep thirst for a woman who will never leave me like my mom. And on the other hand, I've discovered something which objectifies women and it actually feeds that thirst. Okay? And you're like, now, for your psychologist, you're like, oh my goodness, I can't wait to hear, like, there's going to be so much fodder from this, like down the road. And there was. Okay. So, one of the things that happened, and I'm trying to give you a very quick whirlwind tour. Basically, I tried to just check out of life. So the way that I checked out of life, we didn't have video games back then. Pac-Man was like just coming out. It was like, I escaped into books. And the Lord of the Rings in particular. Here was another world. Not just with where there was a happy ending, but where people actually did the right thing, even if it cost them their lives. And what I really wanted was somebody who would do the right thing. Okay, so I threw myself into books. The Lord of the Rings was amazing. And then I was like, okay, where's the next Lord of the Rings? And I actually started to find that it was really hard to find great, compelling books. A lot of them were just fluff. Okay? And then so I'd go back and read The Lord of the Rings again. I so wanted hobbits and like Middle Earth to be real. Okay, but it's not. And you read it and you're like, but this isn't real. And so what happened is in junior high, after 5th grade, my dad got remarried. Now it's really not coming back together. I moved back to Montana. He had gotten promoted off the road. I now have, where this all ends up is, there's 4 original siblings, 3 halves, and I have 2 steps. So there's 9 of us total. In junior high, I'm becoming increasingly just discouraged with like escaping into books. And I happen to pick up my Bible and start reading it. My dad still went to church. And guess what I discover in the Bible? Here's an amazing story that actually claims to be true. But I'm sitting and looking at the people in my church, particularly junior hires, and they are all like, oh yeah, we believe all of this stuff, and yet they're talking about, we gotta stop the clinking.
Nina.
There we go. The kids in junior high,
Nina.
the kids in junior high are like in church, giving all the right answers. Of course we believe this stuff about Jesus, but all they can talk about is, like drinking, smoking, parties on the weekend, sex and drugs. And I'm just like, okay, wait just a second. Like if this stuff is real, shouldn't it be changing our lives? And I looked around the church and realized a lot of the adults were basically just grown-up versions of the kids. In other words, it wasn't really, they would come on Sundays, they would say and do all the stuff, but this thing that we believed wasn't making a big difference in anyone's life. And so I was on the verge of going, like, this is a joke too. And then what happened is I met a guy named John Wayne. John Wayne's not his real name. He was a youth pastor. But John Wayne, he was a youth pastor that's like, God is real. And I remember the very first time he came, I can do this really quick, this is worth it. John Wayne. Okay, this youth group that I was a part of burned through adult leaders. They were brutal. They were merciless. They would mock. They would rebel. And it's like you get parents that would volunteer to lead this little youth group of 30 kids, and they'd last like 2-3 weeks. And the kids are like, how soon can we get the next one? Like out. It was kind of this running thing. They were awful. And finally, nobody would lead the youth group. And there was a guy in church that had been a youth pastor at a different church in the past. And they're like, please, would you lead the youth group? And he's like, fine, I'll do it. They weren't paying him anything. So John Wayne shows up and he's like, hey, we're starting a Bible study. And if you don't want to study the Bible, don't come, because I'll kick your butt out. And I'm like, ooh, okay. So the first week, there's like 30 kids in Bible study. And John Wayne is like, Brennan, where's your Bible? And Brennan's like, none of these kids had ever cracked a Bible. And he's like, Hey, dude, would you go to football practice without a helmet? Would you go to a baseball game without a glove? He's like, get your butt in, like get serious about God. And everybody was like, holy crap. And I was like, yeah. Okay, so that's why I call him John Wayne. He's like, God is real. He is alive and well in this world. He wants to use you. We are going to devote our lives to taking on hell with our squirt gun. Like we're in it to win it. But we're going to invest in spiritual things, not in like earthly success. Okay. So there was a good part about this. He really believed, but really what he was offering was a gospel of commitment. Look at how committed I'm going to be. This was the apostles, Peter and the guys. They're like, hey, even if everybody else leaves, we won't. He was really, he was like, you need to sell out and follow Jesus. And I'm like, I am going to sell out and follow Jesus, because here's why. I had actually concluded, why did my mom leave my dad? She wasn't religious enough. She wasn't spiritually committed enough. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be spiritually committed. I'm going to be more spiritually committed than anybody you have ever seen. You know what my nickname was in high school? Turn or burn Cryder. I was very hardcore. And it was, but here's the thing. Here's the downside of it. When you build your identity around commitment, you end up crushing people. For instance, I'd be like, Brennan, if I get up and read my Bible at 5:30, why can't you? Don't give me any excuses. Get after it. Do you feel how, now listen, if you do it, you actually feel pretty good. You feel proud. But if you fail and everybody fails, it crushes you, because you're not actually living up. Okay, so this is me. I'm devoting my life to actually trying to be this kind of guy, and I'm starting to radically reorient. Okay? But guess what I'm also still struggling with? Lust, porn. So what do you think that does to my sense of commitment? Wrecks it, devastates it. What happens, I'll just say this, all through high school and into college, struggles with the flesh leads to masturbation, leads to relationships that were very physical. Every relationship I was ever in got very physical very quickly. Okay? I never had sex before marriage, but it was amazing and miraculous, because I could not control that aspect of my life. It wasn't like I was disciplined. In other words, my discipline was not touching or taming the places where my heart was like out of control. Okay? Commitment wasn't taming it, so I was racked with guilt. I went off to college. I actually got into West Point, MIT, Stanford, Case Western. Did not get into the Air Force Academy because my eyesight was too bad. Got into all those places. We were very poor. And I'm like, I'm going to Bible college. My dad's like, what? And I'm like, I'm serving Jesus. He's like, Stanford says like lack of finances is not a reason not to come. I'm like, no. And my dad's like, I got a zealot on my hands. And I was like, no, I'm just committed, unlike you. You hear how like, I was a dick. Okay? Went to college, went to Wheaton College, met Marilyn. My goal was to become a youth pastor, and to devote my life to ministry. Still struggle with lust, but I thought at the time it's because I'm not married. So if I just get married, can have sex, then I won't struggle with it anymore. So I got married. We had lots of sex. And guess what? Still struggle with lust for other people. Okay. The ministry thing did not work out very well. Church politics. And what I found was, here I am trying to serve God, and all the door, it just feels like I'm getting, like, of all people, I'm actually trying to serve you, Lord. and churches don't want me, and people don't want to be serious about their faith. It was actually really good because at the time I just would have been deaf to people. Because what I would do is say, you got to be committed like me. And my problem is I'm just not committed enough. I need to be more committed. I need to get up earlier. I need to read my Bible more. So we got married, poor Marilyn. Ministry did not work out. That was very painful. I spent 14 years in software, had 3 kids. I decided to pursue ministry a second time. So I think I was 34, we moved to Philadelphia, and I spent 4 years going through grad school, seminary. And at that point, I'm like, I'm now actually getting advanced training so I can be really effective as a pastor, very noble. And during the middle of it, I just about blew up my marriage, okay? Because I couldn't tame the lust of my heart. So there was a person that we were both friends with, and my heart started to fall for her. So what do you do when you're John Wayne? You like suck it up, buttercup. You know, you like pray and you fast and you just try to grit your way through. And guess what? I did all of those things and I couldn't tame my heart. And I got to a point where I remember thinking, if something doesn't change, I'm going to make a pass at this person. And she is either going to be receptive, which is going to end everything, or she's not going to be receptive, which is still going to end everything. You see what I'm saying? I realized it. I knew that I did not have the capacity, and I'm like, this is like wrecking me. And Marilyn didn't have a clue. And I remember I went home and I had been studying, and Marilyn's like talking happily about something. I'm thinking, you don't have a clue about what's going on in my heart right now. And it felt terrible because we've always been pretty open and honest with one another. And so I actually confessed everything. And I said, I don't know how to fix myself. I've tried everything. And I love you too. It's not that I don't love you. Because what our culture says, oh, if you just find the right person, you won't struggle with it. It's like, no, I had a great person. But basically, I'm like, I cannot control my wayward heart. And I love you too much not to be honest with you. And so I'm going to be completely honest and transparent. Whatever you say here, if you say you want to divorce me, you know, Jesus says if you look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery in your heart. I'm like, so you could argue, you've got grounds. I will not fight it. I will agree with you. I have not been faithful in my heart. If you want me to drop out of seminary, if you want me to never see this person again, basically I will do whatever you want me to do, but I'm kind of at your mercy here, and I want to be honest with you. And what Marilyn said was, this is the key part. Number one, she was floored, did not see it coming, absolutely devastated. I hadn't cheated on her, but I was right on the verge of it. And what she said was, Christian, and later she'd say, I don't know where this came from. So I think she's probably going to give credit to God for this. Because her head was just reeling. She said, Christian, I love you. Not because you're a great husband, because I'm not, but because you're my husband. And she said, we're going to get through this. And what do you think happened to my heart? My heart melted. Okay, let me give you a couple of implications of grace. This is kind of the third point. So first of all, I would say that what Marilyn was doing when she said, I love you, not because you're a great husband, but because you're my husband, she was saying that love was not contingent on my performance. She was saying that her love was flowing from the basis of our relationship that we were in. Okay? Here's a couple of implications. First of all, I built my entire life trying not to be my mom. You know what it's like to look in the mirror and go, I built my entire life not to be my mom, and to find myself on the verge of being my mom? And she was irreligious and I was religious. And I went, somehow this way of irreligion and this way of religion, both you end up at the same place. What the heck am I supposed to do with that? The first part of grace is being humbled, not just by our unrighteousness, but also by the failures of our righteousness. Isaiah 64 says, our righteousness is like filthy rags. The Christian message is not go be religious, or it's okay to be irreligious. It's like there is a different way, and it starts by recognizing that both of our other paths, irreligion and religion, are both dead ends. They lead to the same place. You've got to be disillusioned with your own your own righteousness. That was the first thing. Second thing, I had spent my entire life looking for a woman who would never leave me. Been married to her the whole time. I just told her the absolute worst thing about me, and she didn't walk away. At the heart of grace, there is this relational commitment, a relational component that allows you to be 100% honest, and the person doesn't walk out on you. And when you experience that, what does Hebrews 13 say? I will never leave you nor forsake you. When that starts to become real to you, and you have somebody that you're like, this person actually isn't going to walk out and leave me, it melts you, all right? When Jesus becomes real to you, or unless Jesus becomes real to you relationally, a real live person, you will never experience grace that changes you. So here was a person I'd been looking for the whole time. I'm already married to her. Third thing, grace is incredibly costly. What did it cost Marilyn to absorb kind of the blow of my wandering heart? Everything. All my failings, she took them on without any strings attached. That costliness is what it takes to penetrate our self-absorption, which is the definition of sin. Okay? If you're not seeing how much it costs Jesus to love you, you won't get grace. Here's the fourth thing. Grace is transformative. This is what I realized. When Marilyn responded to me that way, if you think about on a scale of 1 to 10, here's this potential relationship with this woman that I'm kind of falling for. On a scale of 1 to 10, attraction to her is like an 8, 8.5, 9. But it's all vapor. It's all in my head. It's all imaginary. And then all of a sudden over here, here's Marilyn, the real person that I'm married to. And we're still like sexual, active. We're doing like, it's not like our marriage sucked, but my attraction for Marilyn, real live person, is down like on a 2. And all of a sudden, when I see the real live person who loves me the way she does, you know, I love you not because you're a great husband, but because you're my husband. We're going to get through this. What happened is my attraction for Marilyn went from a 2 to like an 8 or a 9. And the attraction for this other woman went from an 8 or a 9 down to a 2 or a 1. Because all of a sudden I saw really, really clearly, this is real, that is imaginary. Even if I pursue that thing. How many of you know somebody that has actually had an affair? Okay? And then you say, how was it? Every person I know that has actually pursued that regrets it in the end and says, I wouldn't do it again. It did not give me what I thought it was going to give me. I knew that. Okay? Thomas Chalmers, an old Presbyterian dude, famous quote. He says, the only way to dispossess the heart of an old affection is the expulsive power of a new affection. In other words, what he's saying is, you've got something that you know you shouldn't love. You can't just get it out. Your heart loves it. You can't just like stop loving it. What you actually need is to find something else you love more. And what happened was when I saw how Marilyn dealt with me, I went, that is what I've been looking for my entire life. Here's a woman who will not leave me the way my mom did. She's not going to walk out. She's not going to chase after other things. And it melted my heart. And the strength of that new affection with clarity actually just utterly changed, okay, that other affection, sin. Didn't make it go away completely. But what we now had was a relationship where every time I struggled, guess what? I could go talk to her. We could pray about it together. You see what I'm saying? And you start going, this is a really, really significant relationship. Now, I want to say something very important here. Marilyn's grace did not rescue me. She's great, but she's not a Messiah. Whoa. If you look to a spouse to be your Jesus, it will actually destroy both you and them. But what Marilyn's grace did was she modeled Jesus' grace. And I went, wait a second, if this is how Marilyn treats me, and for the first time in my life, this is doing something with my wayward heart's lusts. What if this is actually a small picture of how Jesus loves me? See what I'm saying? Do you hear the grace and truth component in here? Okay? You're not a great husband. That's truth. But you're my husband. That's grace. All right? Last thing. Grace propels you forward in a way that's good, but it's scary. There's just two parts to this. First of all, when this happened, when I started to experience grace, number one, it completely undid me. First of all, in the scriptures, I'm starting to see all of these places where I'm like, how come nobody ever told me about this grace thing before? And it's like, all of a sudden, I'm finding it everywhere. And I'm like, how did I not see this before? And what that did, number one, it encouraged me. But number two, it changed how I talk to other people. Because instead of going like, hey, here's what you need, let me tell you what you need, Olivia. You need, do you hear how condescending that is? You need this. I was like, man, I don't know what you need. But I know I am a mess, and yet Jesus has had mercy on me, and for the first time in my life, he feels real, and my life is starting to change. And I literally had friends who were not Christians who were like, tell me more about that. Do you see how it changes the conversation? Instead of like, here's what you need, is here's what I am finding. Here's what I am tasting. But there's a scary side to this as well. You can read this in Tim Keller's Reason for God, his chapter on grace. He said they had a woman at his church at one point who was she was not a Christian, she was exploring Christianity, and she was starting to really like get it. And he saw her one day after the service and he said, hey, what are you thinking? And she goes, this grace thing is scary. And he said, anytime somebody says grace is scary, that shows you they're paying attention. And he goes, tell me more. And she goes, listen, if grace was based on works, if God's favor was based on works, let's say it that way, then I would be like an employee. He'd be like the employer. I'd be like an employee, but everything's transactional and I've got rights. In other words, he can only ask so much of me. He's got to do this. I've got to do this. If I do this, he gives me this. See how transactional that is? There would be a limit to what he could ask. But if God operates out of sheer grace, if I'm accepted simply out of his graciousness, this relationship, then there would actually be no limit to what he could ask of me. Marilyn could have asked me, you need to drop out of seminary. You need to never see this person again. Okay? God could actually ask me to do anything. And that becomes very, very scary. because I might need to lay down my life. But I can do it because I can trust him. Do you see what I'm saying? That's the part about grace. There is no limit to what God can ask. Grace is a thing that we need to experience. Grace is a thing that we need to embody. Grace is the thing that we need to offer. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And I've got a few questions that we can talk about over lunch. So let me pray for us and we'll come to the Lord's Supper.